Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this narration of the web novel Burning Stars, Falling Skies, taken from both HFY and Royal Road. The link to the original will be down below, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. And if you do, please subscribe, like, and comment so that the great algorithm and all its wisdom decides to help grow this channel. Chapter 3. Lament. Threedak lovingly dug into the moist swamp soil. Her eggs could be warm, damp, and safe. They wouldn't suffer from the predation of desert mites or risk having their shells cracked from the dry, baking heat of the day. Instead, the thick, loamy dirt would keep them in perfect temperatures as her young matured enough to break free from their shells and escape into the nearby swamp, where they would subsist on bugs and minnows until they grew old enough for the genetic memories to activate. Then her daughters would return to her, and together they would go about in the important work of reforming the scattered and miserable DrakeBear people. With the hole deep enough to accumulate a heavy clutch she planned on laying, she moved her body over to the pit and went about her business of becoming a mother. The humans called this a miracle of birth, but as Threedak had poured through their memories, they seemed to focus more on trauma and scream in pain. Even after the children were born, they were helpless and dependent on their mothers for years. She grunted in slight discomfort as another egg slid into the nest. Really, the DrakeBear were way better at this. Amass enough protein to lay eggs, focus the memories on emotions and imprint it on the eggs, and then simply deposit them someplace safe and sheltered from the environment. After the whelps were born, they would mature on their own or die of starvation, disease, or predators. Either or. She hoped that a large number of her young would survive. Once they gained their memories, they would become a useful part of her quest to restructure the DrakeBear society. Maybe later, when there were more enlightened beings around, they would be set up nurseries and creches for the care of the young and prevent the atrocious generational losses. Until then, all she could do was lay her eggs and hope that they were lucky. Threedak focused on the memories that earned by eating the last of the humans. Images of science and experimentation flickered through her mind as she imprinted them on each egg. Even the DrakeBear lacked in many ways compared to humanity. The genetic memories would let them advance at a prodigious rate. Each of her young would be born with the equivalent of several doctorates and degrees worth of research. They might not have had life experience to go with that training, but the wealth of theoretical knowledge and skills would help them survive long enough to gain that experience. She pulled herself away from the nest and began burying it using her graspers. Once the channel was safely under earth, she chuffed in contentment before finding a squat swamp tree. With a little bit of work, she worried a straight branch from it. Then she began walking, keeping her eyes entrained on either of the threats of her goal. After an hour or two, she stopped, poking a firm ground in front of her with a stick before turning happily to herself. She dug deep into the wet clay, and each stroke of her clawed graspers excavated more of the sticky substance from the swamp. One of the hardest parts of creating civilization from scratch was picking a starting point. On her trudge out to the desert, Threedak had considered two starts. The first was searching the nearby mountains for materials which would make tools. According to her new memories, those mountains were the culprit of being a dichotomy of desert and the low-lying wetlands that she dealt in now, scraping the condensation from the sky and preventing the rain clouds from reaching their former tribe. The other was to find clay and bake it in the daytime heat of the desert until it became terracotta. Given her simple tools, the most she would be able to make with terracotta was crude bricks and a basic pottery. But Threedak was sick of being unable to store what she found. Right now, she was restricted to whatever she could carry on by hand, a fact that prevented her from raiding a crashed shuttle of its plentiful but jagged shards of metal. If she was to go on the mountains in search of needed minerals for such a lime or flint, having a pot or container to haul it back was essential. Memorizing the nearby landmarks and twisting trees and rolling logs, she filled her arms with the wet clay and marched towards the edge of the swamp. The journey took her almost an hour, but it was blissfully uninterrupted by predators or swamped tribe. At the edge of the desert, Threedak began fashioning pots and trays from the malleable clay, using the stick to hollow out the pots and smooth the trays. She didn't have any way to assuring the purity of the clay or controlling the heat when the sun baked it, so she suspected that the end product would be rough at best. Whether her dream was made of 100 or 1,000 or 100,000 small steps, she would pursue it because she must. Once she had the terracotta pottery, it would make her next task slightly easier. The next task would make her third task simpler. It might not be today, tomorrow, or even in her daughter's lifetimes, but through accumulation of sheer force of will, she would civilize the barren wastelands. The first javelin struck the soil next to her, wobbling harmlessly. She had known the swamp tribe would not suffer her dwelling near them in peace, but she hadn't expected him to act this quickly. Calmly, Threedak spit the needle pistol out into her hand and turned to face the 3 LtwzL in the swamp tribe that were moving towards her. All of them were armed with crude stone weapons, really little more than sharpened rocks affixed to tree branches with hardened sinew. They hissed at her, their neck pouches bulging in ritual challenge. Almost reverently, Threedak wiped the saliva from the needle pistol and disabled the safety with one of her grasper's foreclaws. The 3 tribeswomen stalked closer, panning out to surround Threedak. She puffed out her own neck pouches, letting out a good ragged croak of dominance that startled the approaching tribeswomen. They stopped their advance in confusion and began hurriedly whispering to each other. Calmly, she pointed the pistol at the first of her enemies and depressed the firing stud. It jerked into a grip like a dying hotgun, magnetic microcoils accelerating a sliver of metal and slamming it into the neck of one of the approaching LtwzL. With a startled croak, her victim clawed at her throat with her graspers before collapsing to the ground. One of the injured woman's 2 companions dropped to all sixes and hurried over towards her, while the other charged Threedak. She shifted her aim, letting Ashley's memory guide her. The human's long hours in the firing range paid off, but Threedak fired her second round, spinning her opponent around and sending one of her graspers flying into the air, disconnected from her body in a fountain of gore. The injured LtwzL croaked in pain, collapsing to the ground. Threedak fired a final round into her, ripping a deep, bloody hole into her upper back. The final tribeswoman stood up onto her hindmost pair of legs in surrender, waving her graspers frantically. A day ago, Threedak would have accepted her surrender, but now she just saw her as another potential failure point. She was alone, and trust could get her killed. Any thoughts of mercy needed to be tempered by the risk inherent in the swamp tribe knowing she was in the area. Threedak touched the firing stud once again, ripping through the surrendering LtwzL's throat with a sliver of steel. It was unfortunate that the actions were necessary, but she would put better use to these protein of the Threedak's daughters. The towering LtwzL fell to the muddy slough, unmoving, without any further fanfare. Threedak approached the 3 corpses and began eating. Their memories were vague and blurry, merely a collection of images without any real thought or drive behind them. Threedak winced slightly. That was her only a day ago, living her life in a fog and barely sapient, without the knowledge and capacity to truly contextualize what was going on around her. Only now, looking back, could she see that her former self was closer to an animal, ruled by instinct and hunger, than a properly intelligent being. She finished consuming the last of her enemy's flesh. Their thoughts were barely worth adding to her own. She learned the location of the swamp tribe's village as well as their numbers, approximately 25 LtwzL, now that 3 of them had died. She chuffed to herself in disappointment. The largest tribe she was aware of, and it would barely rate a human hamlet. Her people had an almost impossible distance to travel. Once again, Threedak dug a nest, letting the rhythmic strokes of her graspers help her ease her digestion as she prepared to lay another clutch of eggs. The process repeated itself without interruption. This time she imprinted the memories of the human warriors in her first clutch of eggs and the human engineers in the second. Unfortunately, there was a limit to what she could directly pass on to her young. Their minds were fragile when they first awakened, and overloading their synapses would simply break them. Still, her new civilization would need all types. Finally, after 3 DrakeBear were stripped bare and both of the new clutches of eggs were laid and buried, Thirg returned to her work. Over the course of 3 days, she excavated clay and set it out to bake into bricks in the hot desert sun. She didn't yet have a mortar, not having ventured into the mountain to look for lime, but she stacked the crude bricks in wet mud to make a square one-room building. Finally, she placed boughs of the nearby trees over the top of the structure. It wasn't much. Her construction barely kept the swamp's frequent rains out, and the walls rattled in the high winds. Thirg was sure that it was the first purpose-built made structure on the surface of the planet that had to count for something. She curled up in her new house, tail touching the nose of her muzzle. The last couple days had been near constant work without rest. Soon she would need to venture forth into the mountains to look for the minerals her new society would need, but until then she could take a moment to relax and reflect. In a very non-DrakeBear moment, Thirg decided that the city what she was finding would be named to DrakeBear. Names were meaningless beyond the designation for an individual. They simply didn't have enough exposure to the world to need to use such proper nouns for anything. There was only one planet, desert, and swamp that her tribe was exposed to, so all of them became the desert, planet, and swamp. Tribes were almost as simple. The world consisted of your tribe and the other tribes. Sometimes other tribes would be notated by the nearby landmark like the swamp tribe. But more often or not, their distinction wasn't necessary. It was a very simple way of looking at things that fit for the simple people that the DrakeBear currently were. She pondered, searching for a name that would summarize her gratitude and the debt to humanity for providing their memories to her, as well as her feelings towards the DrakeBear as a whole. Something to encapsulate the entirety of the titanic struggle ahead of her, as well as the ultimate failure of her unwitting benefactors. The membranes covering her eyes nictated as she stared into the loose brick in her wall for a long time. Eventually, she closed her eyes, satisfied with the choice. For as much as the people had gained, humanity had lost infinitely more. When she met her daughters for the first time, she would stroke their soft scales with her graspers and tell them the story behind the humans that died so that they might have culture. She would weave a tale of their final-doomed battles against the invaders and how, despite everything, they fought to the last. She would tell them the name of their new home, Lament. End of chapter. And that, my friends, concludes this video. I hope that you enjoyed. If you enjoyed the story, please follow the link down below and let the author know. If you wish to support this channel, you can do all the usual YouTube gumph, like subscribing, following, and more importantly, sharing. All of these things do help the channel grow. If you wish to do more, there are links for donations, Patreon, and channel memberships as well. And until the next time, I hope that you all have a wonderful one. I will see you in the next video. Cheers.